we're going to talk about pattern and texture and how we can effectively identify it, but also create it in a variety of different ways. So basically what we're looking to learn from this topic is to describe different ways that pattern can capture visual interest, identify examples of how order and variety can work together, understand how, although this is where it gets a little bit, not tricky, but every texture makes some sort of a pattern. Not every pattern can be or has to be a texture, if that makes sense, right? We can have patterns that don't have texture. And then identify examples of both tactile and visual texture in pieces of art. So essentially, pattern is the wow, as I trip over that. Pattern is the repetition of design motif. So you can see in the image we have on the right, in this photograph of Fred, teenagers in their bedrooms, you can see that sort of automatically, naturally, whatever you want to call it, that humans are relatively drawn to pattern, right? So even with all these images of celebrities, athletes, etc., that this gentleman has in his room, you can start to see just by how he's hanging them, whether it was intentional or not, that like sort of patterns start to emerge or patterns start to form, right? So early humankind found patterns within seasonal change and lunar cycles, right? So we all kind of recognize this. We were just talking about it. My family just went to Canada to visit my in-laws this weekend, and we were finding it very interesting that the trees are already really starting to change when you go way up north towards the border, all that fun stuff. So we can start to see even just simple patterns like that emerge, right? Maine in the fall is a good time to check that out, or New England when people do the leaf peeping, all that fun stuff. But you can start to see as the seasons start to change, there's those seasonal changes and patterns, natural patterns even start to form with trees and things like that, right? Patterns can be intricate or simple. And as I said before, humans sort of have a natural desire to kind of add visual interest to fill empty surfaces and spaces, right? It's almost kind of like we're driven to, you know, if we had this giant empty wall in front of us, like a giant wall like this in our house that was like totally blank. Some people can totally deal with that. I personally can. If you look at my office, I have a bunch of pictures, but nothing on the wall yet, mainly because I'm lazy. But we have a tendency to want to fill empty spaces, right? So basically, pattern is creating some sort of visual interest. How do we create that visual interest? A pattern can begin with a unit or a shape that's repeated. And these units or shapes can be a variety of different patterns, not limited to this, but crystallographic, so creating an overall pattern or an all-over pattern. Most patterns are grid-based in some sense, right? Since it's a repeating shape or repeating unit, we kind of naturally form grids to repeat these patterns. Abstract, floral motifs, and geometrics are frequent pattern subjects, especially like when you look at fashion or you look at textiles, and even like my plaid shirt, you can start to see a pattern. So even with simple patterns, again, textiles are a very good thing to look at for patterns. Patterns are built generally on complex symmetries, repetitions, and rotations, right? So we have some visual examples of this. So this is a general shape that's repeated. It can be transformed, but transformed and repeated into some sort of grid, right? So if we look here, as I put my coffee right in front of my mouse. So as we look here, this is the same exact pattern, just one is a little bit more zoomed in than the other. So on the left, going back to our friend Escher, we have a triangular module here. If you essentially isolate the one shape of this fish, like some of it obviously falls outside of the triangle, but you get the general idea. So that will be a triangular pattern that's repeated. It's flipped in the cases of the grays, and then the color is changed, and then the pattern radiates out from this triangular shape, right? We can take that same pattern and analyze it. It doesn't mean that there's a specific wrong or right way to look at it, but just different modes of creation, right? So in this one, we're looking at sort of a more hexagon repeat, right? So you can see as we zoom out a little bit from just the isolated fish, you can have these 6 fish now as they're flipped, and this can essentially be the tile that you create to flip and repeat. So you can see we have one hexagon tile here, and then the other hexagon tile here, And then as you kind of look, you can kind of imagine, so these hexagon patterns keep repeating, right? So there's just a variety of different ways to, when you come up with patterns, to plan your patterns, how you can make those patterns repeat, and so on, right? So texture and pattern, we'll go over some similarities and some differences, right? They're related, but not exactly the same. So basically a texture arouses our sense of touch in some way, right? So when we look at the image on the right, I keep wanting to say left, that's why I pause. We get this almost sort of wood grain texture, right? And what that does is it sort of makes us think of, I shouldn't say we all, but we all should be like relatively familiar with how like a wood grain feels, right? So that should sort of trigger a memory or trigger a sense, right? Texture is more than an irregular pattern or repeat. It's rather, sorry, I did that the opposite. It's more of an irregular pattern rather than a repeat than a pattern. Holy cow. So you can see this isn't so much a pattern as there's not anything here that's absolutely repeated like the fish, right? It looks similar, so you can see there's almost 1, 2, 3, 4 bars, I guess, vertical bars if you want to look at it like that. But they are all technically different, all of the lines. There might be some repeats of a line here and there, but most of these sort of elements are all irregular and there's not a repeat, right? There's not so much a grid format with a texture, right? A texture makes the object feels like it has a tactile surface, again, sort of triggering that memory sense. Texture can be shown by areas of light and dark, shadow, glossiness. So even as we see here, as the tone varies, it alters the texture. We have a much lighter tone on this side and a darker tone on this side, and then even these bands of darker vertical tones sort of start to add depth to our pattern, right, or to our texture. Texture, like I said, can evoke a memory of touch, right? If we're familiar with how stonework like this feels, then it, you know, seeing a texture like that in print or paint should sort of evoke that recall or evoke that memory, right? Jewelry, ceramics, furniture, fiber art, textiles rely on texture to enhance their effect. Interior designers rely on pattern and texture a lot, more texture, as we're talking about in this case. They rely on texture a lot. If you have sort of a monochromatic palette that you're working with in a particular room, which is just basing your color palette on one color, right, monochromatic, you can really vary that by using a variety of textures, right? This is a terrible example, but like if you had a room that was all essentially this sort of beige-ish color, and you had a window and a couch in front of the window, and they were all generally that same part of that monochromatic color scheme, you could vary it by having like a very, very textured couch against a very sort of flat or gloss wall, and then you could have, you know, your curtains or window dressings and have another different kind of heavy texture on those curtains, and that would vary your visual interest, even though you're working with a very limited color palette, right? So in the case here, right, we're essentially working with a limited color palette with this image that's been broken up. But you can see varying the patterns, again, even though the palette is relatively limited, except for these pops of red, which create more visual interest. But between the roof and some of this stonework, the color palette is fairly limited, but the visual interest is still there, right? You can still create that visual interest by varying I keep wanting to say patterns, by varying the texture, right? So the texture is very different from this close-up view of the roof tiles to the further away shot of the roof tiles, and then perhaps a different set of roof tiles from this building, and even just the different variations on the level of zoom, how close or far away you are from the stone patterns can create that visual interest, right? Then we can talk about tactile texture, right? Kind of like going way back to our lines, where we have physical lines, implied lines, etc. It can work similarly with texture, right? So there are basically two categories of artistic texture, tactile and implied, right? So a tactile or actual texture is texture that can literally be felt. So if you have a painting that has very, very, very heavy paint work, a lot of like Van Gogh, things like that, that have just a lot of paint on the canvas, it's actually creating literal texture with the brush strokes and things like that. So you're physically building texture, right? Architecture and sculpture have tactile texture, just being three-dimensional. An object has texture. In painting, again, an uneven paint surface when you use a thick pigment. When you use that style, it's called impasto. You guys should hear that in your art history courses. But basically to create a rough 3D painted surface. And then there's implied, kind of going back to like our implied lines, right? It can only be observed, not physically felt. And I'll show you exactly what that means. So again, as we talked about texture as paint on a canvas, we have this heavy, heavy brushwork. And if you see this painting in real life, all of these swirls, especially like in his jacket, but all of this texture is actual physical texture. Like the paint on Van Gogh's work is very, very, very thick. And that was sort of part of the point, part of the process, was creating this physical texture by building up the surface area. It also, especially with oil paint, especially a long time ago, with oil paint, doing this kind of style takes a very, very long time because you need to build up your layers and then let it completely dry, and oil paint takes forever to dry. So you need to let it dry or cure in some cases and then rework it. So you would often have multiple projects going at various stages so that you could build this sort of almost like a sculptural element. Then we talk about implied texture, right? So implied texture is the illusion that texture exists when in reality the surface is actually smooth, right? And that's some of the things we're going to explore with our assignment. So we have here these dot patterns and brush strokes imply different textures, right? So Liechtenstein was very famous for a lot of the work that he produced these very sort of offset print comic book type feels. Like if you look at specifically comic books, but newspapers, if you sort of look really, really close, you can see the actual dot patterns that create the pieces, where he explored that by really enlarging these dot patterns. I'm sure you guys have all seen Liechtenstein, just might not have known it. It's in pop culture. It's used in consumables all over the place, or you've seen things that are references to it. Anyway, but you can see that these brush strokes, they look, I mean, they're very sort of like comic book-ish illustrative, but you can see that it implies that sort of similar brushstroke. Like if we were to zoom out of this and compare it to sort of the Van Gogh, you would see somewhat of a similar, aside from the dot pattern, somewhat of a similar feel, right, with the brushstrokes. So we have the physical brushstrokes in the Van Gogh, and then the implied brushstrokes in our Liechtenstein here. You can create tactile texture through collage, which is something that we'll explore in a couple of assignments. So you're basically creating a design by cutting and pasting bits of whatever you're using, cloth, textured, colored paper, other materials, etc. Collage is an excellent medium for beginners because you don't have to worry about like actually producing the elements, which is why we're working specifically a lot with design. You start with black and white because it's a little bit more simpler to grasp some of the concepts of design, some of the basics when you're just using a limited color palette like black and white, like we have been doing this semester. But yeah, you can use a lot of found images, found materials, so you don't necessarily have to worry about producing the content or producing the materials. You have the materials to produce your content. Materials are usually easy to use and save the artist time trying to recreate a desired texture. Forms can be altered and reshaped quickly before you actually like finalize and stick them down. You can move elements around rather than painting. Like once paint is on the canvas, you can potentially scrape it off, but generally like that sort of, in air quotes, undo feature isn't really there when you're working with sculpture, painting, etc. There's ways you can do it, but it's really difficult. But with collage, you can kind of move elements around. You can arrange and arrange and arrange before you finalize your collage. Yeah, so that's basically what I just said. Compositional arrangements can be easily tested and altered. Tactile texture, using found objects. There's a lot of artists that work with materials that you find rather than purchase. Conservation of materials, recycling has roots within the art world, right? A lot of times too, and I'll say we, but a lot of times too is because the term sort of starving artist or a poor artist is a term for a reason, right? Especially early on, there's a lot more artists that don't necessarily pay the bills with their fine art than there are famous artists, right? It's kind of similar to like musicians. It's really hard to be a rock star, right? It's also really hard to be a famous artist. So a lot of times to save money, you find materials or you get resourceful, right? So doing found object work can be helpful with saving resources. Or sometimes an unpleasant material can be transformed into something pleasing, right? Sometimes you can take literal garbage and then turn it into a relatively pleasing sculpture or art piece, right? Folk art often works with found materials. There's a lot of recycling, repurposing, things like that in folk art and crafting. So if you see here in our image here, strips of the earth's skin, and this is a detail of it, but this is all used aluminum and copper wire of various different types, but basically this is all just different copper and aluminum and wire woven together, and you create this interesting texture, potentially interesting pattern through found objects. Visual texture, which is something that we're going to explore in our assignment. You have visual texture, again, sort of like that implied texture. There is a term for some visual texture called trompe-l'oeil, which is a French term that means to fool the eye. That's what it literally means, or trick the eye. Sometimes it's called deceptive painting. Generally, it's something that looks so realistic that I wouldn't even say photorealistic because it doesn't look like a photo. It's so realistic that it looks like real life, right? A lot of growing up in New York, New Jersey, a lot of like cheesy Italian restaurants used to have that trompe-l'oeil like painting on the wall to make it look like you're in Tuscany or something like that, and it looks so real. It never really does, but it looks so real that it looks like you're in the whatever. We've all kind of seen this before, right? So this is an example under a bridge in Albany. All of this stonework underneath this bridge is 100% painted. And as you back away, obviously from this far away, it's near impossible, especially if you're driving by. It's near impossible to tell that this is just a painting, right? So this would be a great example of trompe-l'oeil where it looks so realistic, even the shadow and the depth, going from the flat here and then this sort of relief, as you can see as the columns go back. It's so realistic, it's painted so realistically that it actually looks like real brick and carvings, but it's all paint. Another way to use it, basically you would have things to employ when you're looking with trompe-l'oeil is attention to detail, generally a lower relief. If you have something like going back a little bit to here, the relief basically just means like the depth. So when you have a relief sculpture, it's something that's essentially carved into a flat surface. So there's like a recess, if that makes sense. So you want to have a low relief, which basically means it's relatively shallow, right? So the deeper the relief or the deeper the inset, the harder it is to create that depth on a flat surface, right? Because as it gets deeper and deeper, as you move physically to look at the piece, theoretically the shadow should move. So if you have a little bit of a shallow relief, the shadows sort of work with you a little bit more. The deeper your shadows, the harder it is to pull off. Same thing with texture and space. Another example here, you kind of see this sort of liquid text where you have, again, sort of a low relief, liquid on a flat surface, but the shadow and the highlights work really, really, really well together to create that sort of slick look that looks like literal liquid on a flat surface. And I believe that's the end. So these are some of the concepts that we're going to start to work with working with texture and pattern for these assignments.